A harsh, sudden clatter of cutlery rang through cinder and sage like a verdict, followed by the strangled gasp caught in a young woman's throat as the steaming pumpkin soup slid down her bare forearm. The entire VIP room fell silent, forks frozen midair, a lady by the window dropping her glass. Cordelia Prescott stood there, the bowl tilted in her hand, the satisfied smile of a 25-year-old who'd never once had to face a consequence blooming across her perfectly manicured face. The server she'd just scalded was named Delphine Hartwell. 27 years old, her dark brown hair pulled tight at the nape of her neck, her quiet gray eyes carrying the kind of stillness that belongs to someone who's endured too much and has nothing left to prove. Della didn't cry, didn't scream. She simply pressed the tray to her chest and stood perfectly still, the heat searing her skin. The way a person stands when they've grown all too used to being treated as though they don't exist. Cordelia had no idea, and she never would have guessed, that this one act of meaningless cruelty had just set in motion a chain of events that would burn to the ground the entire political path her father, the Honorable Augustus Prescott, had spent over 2 decades building. Because exactly 3 meters away, at the table tucked into the darkest corner of the room, a man had just set down his glass and risen to his feet. He was tall, broad-shouldered in a charcoal-tailored suit, his black hair silvered at the temples, a faint scar running down his left cheekbone that the candlelight couldn't quite hide. No one in that room dared speak his name aloud, but every single one of them knew exactly who Rocco Abernathy was, and every single one of them understood that when that man stood up, something in the city of Holloway was about to change forever. He didn't say a word. He simply slipped off his coat and walked toward the trembling woman, while Cordelia Prescott, for the first time in her life, felt something ice-cold creep up her spine. She'd chosen the wrong person to humiliate, on the wrong fateful night, in front of the wrong man. And what was about to unfold over the next 9 weeks would prove that sometimes the most powerless person in the room is the very one holding the key that can unlock every door. If you believe a person's dignity should never be measured by the uniform they wear, hit that like button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Because the story of Della Hartwell has only just begun. That distance of 3 meters, beneath the dim yellow candlelight of cinder and sage, was longer than anyone in the room could have imagined, and Rocco Abernathy crossed it with the slow steps of a man who had never once in his life needed to hurry for anyone or anything. He stopped beside Della, who was still clutching the tray tightly to her chest, as though it were the only thing keeping her upright, then laid his charcoal gray suit jacket over her trembling shoulders with a gentleness that stood in stark contrast to the weight of power everyone in the room could feel radiating from him. Della lifted her eyes to him, her gray gaze flashing with something that was not gratitude, but the cautious astonishment of a person who had gone far too long without being seen. Rocco said nothing to her. He only turned his head, and his eyes met Cordelia Prescott's with the cold calm of someone judging an object that had just fallen to the floor. Cordelia's entire group of friends, 4 young people dressed more for photographs than for dinner, fell silent at once, the half-formed smiles still lingering on their lips freezing in place. Rocco spoke, and his voice was low, not loud, but every word dropped onto the table like a piece of ice. He said that in this city, there were people who measured a human being's worth by the uniform they wore, and that those people were always the ones who had never had to earn anything for themselves. He said she had just done something she would have a great deal of time to regret, more time than she imagined. Cordelia blinked, and for one brief moment, the satisfaction on her face wavered, replaced by the confusion of someone who had never heard anyone speak to her in that tone. But she was the daughter of Augustus Prescott, and the arrogance that had been fed in her for 25 years did not collapse easily because of a few sentences. She folded her arms, lifted her chin, and let out a soft laugh full of contempt. She asked him whether he knew who she was, said her father was about to become the most powerful figure in this state, said that with one phone call from her, this shabby little restaurant could be closed before sunrise, and that anyone who dared stand on the side of a nameless waitress would pay for it. She glanced at Della with disgust, then looked back at Rocco, waiting for him to step back the way every man had always stepped back before the Prescott name. But Rocco did not step back. One corner of his mouth lifted, not quite a smile, but the expression of a man who had just heard something both amusing and pitiful. He said he knew very well who her father was, far better than she thought, and that the Prescott name did not frighten him the way it frightened other people. He added, in that same even voice, that real power never needed to loudly threaten a waitress in a restaurant, and that the fact that she had to lean on her father's name to feel important proved only one thing, that by herself, she was nothing at all. That sentence fell over the room like the stroke of a blade, and one of Cordelia's friends drew in a breath so clearly that everyone could hear it. Cordelia's face went pale, then flushed red, her lips moving as she searched for a reply and found none. Behind them, Benedict Fairweather, the restaurant manager, hurried over with a bloodless face, but Rocco had already raised one hand, signaling that no one needed to interfere. He bent down and said only one thing to Della in a voice so quiet only she could hear, asking her name. She answered, her voice still trembling but clear, that her name was Della Hartwell. Rocco nodded once, slowly, as though carving that name into some place in his memory, from which it would never be erased. Then he straightened, letting his gaze pass over Cordelia one final time, a look that no longer held contempt, only absolute indifference, the kind of indifference that could hurt more than anger. He said nothing else. He only turned and walked toward the glass door of the restaurant, moving with the unhurried stride of a man who knew he had just changed something no one in the room had yet managed to understand. The door closed behind him, and in the silence that remained, Cordelia Prescott stood beneath all the eyes watching her, feeling for the first time in her life that the ground beneath her feet was not as solid as she had always believed, though she did not yet know that tonight, the bowl of soup in her hand had lit the fuse on something that could no longer be put out. Only after the glass door closed behind that strange man did Della realize she was still wearing his suit jacket over her shoulders, and the deep, warm scent rising faintly from the expensive fabric was the only thing that made her believe what had just happened had not been a dream. She stood motionless for a while in the private dining room as the murmuring slowly returned, where wealthy guests bent their heads and whispered to one another with undisguised curiosity. And she felt their eyes slide over her in the way she knew far too well, the way people looked at a stain that needed to be cleaned away, rather than at a human being. Benedict Fairweather came closer, the old manager's face marked by a remorse he did not know where to place. He gently rested a hand on her shoulder and said she should go home early tonight, that he would take care of the rest, and, in that hoarse voice there was something almost like an apology, though both of them understood that he had no real power to protect her from people who carried the Prescott name. Della only nodded, took off the suit jacket, and folded it carefully, intending to return it, but Benny shook his head and told her to keep it for warmth, then turned away with the heavy shoulders of a man who had witnessed too much injustice and could do nothing more than lower his head before it. She changed out of her uniform, put on her own thin, worn coat, and stepped outside through the staff entrance, where the cold night air rushed in and struck her face like a bare truth. Late at night, the city of Holloway stretched beneath the pale yellow streetlights, and Della walked alone along the empty street, the stranger's suit jacket held in her arms, the burn on her arm aching with every beat of her heart, a dull pain reminding her that she still existed, that her flesh could still hurt even if this whole world treated her as though she were invisible. She had grown so used to loneliness that it had become part of the structure of who she was, no longer a wound but a foundation, and she wondered how long it had been since someone last stood in front of her to shield her, without asking for anything in return, how long it had been since someone last asked for her name in a serious voice, as though that name deserved to be remembered. That man, Rocco Abernathy, had done both of those things in only a few brief minutes, and it was that unexpected kindness that unsettled her even more than the cruel bowl of soup, because kindness was something Della had learned long ago not to expect, and when it appeared, she did not know what to do with it except doubt it. She did not believe in gifts without a price, did not believe that a man with that much power would care about a nameless waitress out of simple conscience, and as her footsteps sounded steadily on the damp sidewalk, one part of her mind began asking why a man like him had been sitting at the hidden table in the darkest corner of the restaurant on this fateful night. She turned into the alley leading to the old boarding house where she lived, climbed the rickety stairs that gave off their familiar creaks, and opened the door to her tiny one-room apartment, where the darkness greeted her with the silence she had considered her companion for many years. She turned on the only lamp, placed Rocco's suit jacket over the back of a chair, and sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the reddened burn on her arm beneath the murky yellow light. She did not cry, because tears were a luxury that had dried up in her long ago, but something in her chest tightened, a feeling mixed between old humiliation and a new emotion she did not dare name, a small and frightening thread of hope that perhaps, only perhaps, this world still had a place left for her. She glanced toward the corner of the room, where a loose wooden floorboard hid the thing she had quietly protected all this time, and in that still darkness she understood that the quiet, invisible life she had grown used to might soon no longer be safe from disturbance. Della sat still on the edge of the bed for a long time, listening to the old clock ticking on the wall and the steady drip of water from the broken faucet in the tiny kitchen corner, sounds that had become the familiar background music of her life for the past 5 years, since the day she moved into this rented room. Her life was arranged according to a harsh rhythm she had imposed on herself. Endless night shifts at Cinder and Sage, followed by mornings when she stole a few hours of sleep before rushing to her second job at a laundry shop on the other side of the city. And between those two turning wheels were the rare silences she saved for what truly mattered, the thing that no one among the people who saw her every day could ever have guessed. She stood, walked to the corner of the room where the wooden floorboard lay loose beneath the old wardrobe, knelt down, and slipped her calloused fingers into the gap to lift it, revealing a dark hollow underneath, where she kept a rusted metal box hidden away. She took it out, set it on her lap, and opened the lid with the care of someone handling the most precious thing in her life. Inside was a thick stack of files yellowed by time, papers arranged in an order only she understood, copies of documents, numbers, names underlined in red ink, and an old photograph she did not allow herself to look at for too long, because each time she looked at it, her chest tightened. She turned the pages one by one beneath the murky yellow lamplight, her gray eyes moving over lines she had read so many times she knew them by heart, and in the stillness of the room, she lightly touched one finger to a name that appeared again and again on those pages. The name that had become the axis around which every decision she had made for the past several years had turned, the name Prescott. Because Della Hartwell had not come to work at Cinder and Sage by accident. She had chosen that place deliberately, had patiently applied for the job, and accepted the most exhausting night shifts, for one reason she had never spoken of to anyone, a silent purpose she had pursued with the endurance of someone who had nothing left to lose except the truth. She had watched, had listened, had memorized every face that passed through the doors of that luxurious restaurant, and she had waited, patient as a hunter who understood that the most important moment never arrived on the schedule one hoped for. But tonight, something she had not planned had happened, a cruel spilling of soup from the hand of Prescott's own daughter, followed by the appearance of the strange man who had stood up to shield her, and the more Della thought about him, the more uneasy she felt. She set the metal box aside, reached for her old phone, and began searching the name he had not spoken, though everyone in the room had known it, Rocco Abernathy. And when the first results appeared on the screen, her breath caught. Old newspaper articles, distant photographs, rumors written in the cautious language of reporters who did not dare call the truth by its proper name. All of it painted the portrait of a man who controlled the tangled underground networks of Holloway, a man even the most powerful people had to treat with caution, a name whispered in the dark more often than spoken aloud in the light. Della leaned back against the wall, let the phone fall onto the mattress, and closed her eyes, her heart crowded with questions that had no answers. A man like Rocco Abernathy, a man standing at the top of a world she knew only through rumors. Why would he care enough to place his jacket over the shoulders of a nameless waitress? Why would he ask her name as though it deserved to be engraved in memory? And more important than anything, why had he been sitting at the hidden table in the darkest corner of the restaurant on the very night her life began to turn in another direction? She did not believe in coincidence, never had, and when she put the metal box back beneath the wooden floorboard and turned off the light to lie down in the darkness, a vague but persistent instinct told her that the quiet path she had been walking all this time was about to cross another path, and she could not possibly know whether that would be a blessing or a disaster. A few miles north of the city, in an office on the top floor of a building whose lights never went completely dark, Rocco Abernathy stood beside a glass window, stretching from floor to ceiling, looking down at Holloway glittering below, like a chessboard he had played for so long, that he knew the position of every piece by heart. He still had not shed the cold composure that had clung to him all evening, but in his mind, the image of the waitress standing motionless in the private dining room, with hot soup still steaming on her arm, kept returning with an unusual persistence. He had come to Cinder and Sage tonight not for dinner, but for a discreet meeting with a man named Walter Penhaligon, a name very few people in this city knew, yet one that held things capable of making an entire empire tremble. For months, Rocco had quietly sensed the tightening pressure from the Prescott family. Business contracts suddenly broken at the last minute, longtime partners abruptly withdrawing with vague apologies, doors that had once always stood wide open now slamming shut without a word of explanation. And he was wise enough to recognize that behind all of it was the hand of Augustus Prescott, the man on his way to reaching the highest political power and cleaning away every force that might stand in his path. Rocco was not a man easily threatened. He had built his position from foundations few others dared to touch, but he also understood that an enemy wearing the public costume of respectability was far more dangerous than any rival who dared confront him openly. And that was why he had sought out Walter, a man who had once worked inside the Prescott machine and now carried within him the one thing Rocco needed, the truth. Tonight's meeting had not unfolded fully, interrupted by the moment when the sound of a bowl shattering tore through the air and he turned to see that scene, a small woman standing there and enduring it while the whole room lowered its head and pretended not to see. And something inside him, something he rarely allowed to rise, had made him set down his glass and stand. Rocco despised meaningless cruelty, especially the kind of cruelty that those born into silk and safety poured onto people who had no way to strike back, a contempt nourished by privilege and absolute security. And tonight, when he saw it laid bare on the face of the Prescott daughter, he had not been able to remain seated. Now standing alone in the dark office, he realized that his reaction had not been entirely born from compassion alone, but also because there was something about that girl that caught his attention, the way she stood still without crying, without pleading, her gray eyes shining with the strange calm of someone accustomed to endurance, a quality he had seen before in people carrying a heavy secret. He walked to the dark wood desk, picked up the telephone, and called the man who was always stationed outside his door, a man who had followed him for many years and had never once asked the reason for any order. When the door opened and the figure of the large man appeared in the doorway, Rocco turned back, his voice low and clear, ordering him to find out everything possible about a waitress working at Cinder and Sage named Della Hartwell. Who she was, where she came from, why she was there, and whether there was anything about her that could not be seen at first glance. The man nodded, asked nothing more, then withdrew and closed the door behind him. Rocco returned to the window, lifted the glass of liquor to his lips but did not drink, his gaze following the night outside across the city he controlled in large part but had never truly belonged to. He did not know exactly why he had given that order. He only knew that his instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive through so many years in an unforgiving world, was telling him that the girl with the quiet gray eyes was not as simple as she appeared, and that the road he was walking in search of the Prescott family's secrets might, for some reason he could not yet see, soon cross with hers. The report reached Rocco late the next afternoon, placed neatly inside an unmarked envelope on his desk, and when he opened it beneath the pale light of dusk slanting through the glass window, what he read made him sit motionless for a long while, the glass of liquor in his hand forgotten before he could lift it. Della Hartwell, 27 years old, born in Mercer Falls, a small dying industrial town a few hours' drive from Holloway, raised in an ordinary working family until everything collapsed. The person who wrote the report had worked carefully, following every faint trail, and what drew Rocco's attention most lay in the final section, where it stated that Della's father, a man named Theodore Hartwell, had once been a state labor safety inspector, and had died many years earlier under circumstances the official record called natural. While those who had known him whispered a completely different story, He had died not long after beginning an investigation into a series of violations at factories whose hidden ownership, though carefully buried beneath layers of shell companies, ultimately led back to one place, the Prescott family. Rocco set the report down on the desk, and in that moment, two pieces that had seemed separate in his mind suddenly locked together with chilling precision. The girl Prescott's daughter had humiliated the night before was not some nameless waitress who happened to be standing in the wrong place, but the daughter of a man who had died because he dared touch the secrets Rocco himself was hunting, and her presence at Cinder and Sage, the restaurant frequented by Holloway's upper class, suddenly no longer looked like coincidence. He remembered her calm gray eyes, the way she had stood still and endured it without a word of complaint, and now he understood that such calm was not the resignation of a weak person, but the patience of someone waiting for something, someone pursuing a purpose she kept hidden beneath a waitress uniform. Rocco stood, walked to the window as he always did when he needed to think, and let his mind arrange the whole picture slowly emerging before him. For months, he had been searching for a road that would lead him to the truth about the Prescott family, had placed his hopes on Walter Penhaligon and whatever the man possessed, but now it seemed that fate had placed within his reach a piece he had never expected. A person who carried not only motive, but perhaps even evidence she had quietly gathered for years. He was not a man who believed in destiny. He believed in calculation, in carefully weighed moves, but he was also wise enough to recognize when a rare opportunity had found its own way to him. Still, one thing made him hesitate, something he found strange even in himself. He did not want to approach that girl the way he usually approached useful people in his world, as pieces to be used and then swept aside. There was something about Della Hartwell, about the quiet loneliness radiating from her, about the dignity she still held even after being trampled on, that made him feel she deserved a caution and respect he rarely gave anyone. He understood that she would not easily trust him, a man whose name was whispered in the dark, and that if he appeared too suddenly, she would retreat like a wild creature too used to being hunted. Finally, after standing for a long time while the city slowly sank into night, Rocco made his decision. He would go to her, not to force or threaten her, but to show her that this time, perhaps for the first time in many years, she did not have to walk the road she had chosen alone. He turned back to his desk, looked out at the rain-slicked city that now held the girl with the quiet gray eyes, and smiled faintly to himself. A smile neither happy nor sad, only the expression of a man who had just realized that the game he was playing had become more complicated and more worthwhile than ever before. In the vast mansion of the Prescott family, standing on the hill that looked down over the city, Cordelia walked into her father's study with the manner of a child, long accustomed to placing her troubles into someone else's hands so they could be cleaned up for her. She retold the story of the previous night in a version she had carefully polished, a version in which she was the victim of an insolent waitress who had dared show disrespect, and of some strange man who had stepped in and humiliated her in front of her friends without knowing who she was. She did not mention the bowl of soup tilted in her own hand, did not mention her own satisfied smile, and certainly did not mention the way she had stood there enjoying another person's pain. Augustus Prescott sat behind his massive oak desk, listening to his daughter with a face that revealed nothing, but in his cold, sharp eyes was the tireless calculation of a man who had spent more than 2 decades climbing each rung of power, and now stood only a short distance from the highest seat in the state. He did not care who was right or wrong. The only thing that drew his attention was when Cordelia, with the carelessness of someone who had never had to worry about consequences, let slip that several people in the restaurant had raised their phones and recorded the scene. That sentence made Augustus snap his head up, and for the first time during the conversation, a flicker of concern passed across the face that was always so composed. During the most sensitive stage of his campaign, when with every passing day his opponents were lying in wait for a weakness to exploit, a video showing his daughter cruelly burning a poor waitress could become the spark that destroyed the image of the man of the people he had worked so hard to build. He rose, walked around the desk, and in the frighteningly calm voice that terrified everyone beneath him, told Cordelia that she had created a mess and that he would have to clean it up himself, as he always did. That very evening, phone calls were made from Augustus's study, words chosen carefully enough that they could never be classified as direct threats, yet carrying a weight no one could refuse. And one of those calls was placed directly to the owner of Cinder and Sage. The message was very clear. The waitress named Della Hartwell had to disappear from that place, and any footage connected to the incident needed to be handled quietly, or else the restaurant would face troubles no business in Holloway could endure. The next morning, when Della arrived at the restaurant to begin her shift, Benedict Fairweather was already waiting for her at the back entrance with a face marked by the anguish of a man about to do something against his conscience. He led her into the small office, closed the door, and in a choked voice told her that he had no choice, that the order had come from places he could not resist, and that from today onward she could no longer work there. He apologized to her many times, his old hands trembling as he placed her final wages in her hand, along with a small extra amount he had taken from his own pocket, and he said that if one day things changed, his door would always be open to her. Della accepted the envelope, quietly nodded, and in her gray eyes there was no anger or despair. The things Benny had feared he would see, only a strange calm that made him shiver. Because as she walked out of the restaurant for the last time, carrying the small box that held a few personal belongings, Della understood something the Prescott family could never have imagined. They had just severed the last thread tying her to an ordinary life. They had just taken from her the only thing that had made her keep herself hidden and cautious, and by doing so, they had unknowingly set her free. Now she had nothing left to lose, no job to protect, no reason to wait, and a person with nothing left to lose, she knew very well, was more dangerous than anyone the Prescott family had ever faced. Della had walked back to her apartment in the fine drizzling rain of the afternoon, the box holding a few personal belongings clutched in her arms, and when she turned into the familiar alley leading to her boarding house, she noticed a black car parked silently along the curb, the kind of car that never appeared in this poor neighborhood unless it carried something unusual. She slowed her steps, every sense tightening with caution, and then the car door opened, and the man from the night before stepped out, still with that tall frame, still with that cold composure. Only this time he was not wrapped in the polished splendor of a fine restaurant, but standing there in the damp alley, like a shadow dressed in human form. Rocco Abernathy called her name, not in a threatening voice, but with the calmness of someone who had already decided every word he meant to say, and Della stopped in her tracks, letting the box rest under one arm as if guarding a shield, her gray eyes narrowing with suspicion. She asked what he wanted, her voice steady, though a taut thread lay hidden beneath it, and she said plainly that she knew who he was, knew the rumors surrounding his name, and that she did not believe a man like him had come to an alley like this simply to ask after the health of a waitress who had just been fired. Rocco did not deny it, he only nodded slightly, as though he appreciated her directness, then said he knew she had lost her job that morning, knew the Prescott family had given the order, and that he had come to tell her something she needed to hear. Della felt her chest tighten, but she did not let it show. She only asked why he cared, and that was when Rocco stepped a little closer, lowered his voice, and spoke the name that made her entire world sway. He said he knew about her father, knew about Theodore Hartwell, the inspector who had died many years ago, after daring to investigate violations that led back to the Prescott family. Della stood frozen, her knuckles turning white as her grip tightened against the edges of the box, because her father's name was something she had kept hidden for years, a wound she had never exposed to anyone, and hearing this man say it so calmly in the empty alley filled her with both fear and fury. She stepped back and asked how he knew those things, and whether he was someone sent by the Prescotts to spy on her. Rocco shook his head, and this time there was something in his voice that was almost understanding. He said he was not on the Prescott family's side. On the contrary, they were trying to strangle him as well, that he had spent months tracing the secrets of that family, and that he had come to meet a man named Walter Penhaligon on the very night she was humiliated. He said he believed she and he were walking the same road, though they had started from two different places and carried two different pains, and that her enemy was his enemy too. Della remained silent for a long time, the fine rain gathering in her hair, and inside her mind a fierce struggle unfolded between the instinct of suspicion that had rooted itself deep after years of loneliness, and a cold reason that was slowly beginning to recognize that what this man was saying might be true. She understood that trusting an underworld boss like Rocco Abernathy was dangerous, that men like him never did anything without calculation. But she also understood that after losing her job, after drawing the attention of the Prescott family, she was no longer in a position to refuse every ally. She had been alone too long in her fight, quietly collecting each fragment of truth without anyone behind her, and now standing before her was a man who held power and resources she could never have. A man declaring that they shared the same enemy. Finally, Della lifted her head and looked straight into his eyes, and in a soft but steady voice, she said she did not trust him yet, but she was willing to hear what else he had to say. And in that moment, beneath the drizzling rain of Holloway, two secret roads that had once run parallel finally crossed. The meeting took place 3 days later, in a small cafe tucked away on the eastern edge of the city, a place no one from Holloway's upper class would ever set foot in. And Della herself was the one who arranged it, because as it turned out, the connection between her and Walter Penhaligon had existed long before Rocco entered the story. Walter was a man in his 60s, thin, with the weary eyes of someone who had carried a burden too long and could no longer set it down, and he had spent many years working inside the accounting machinery of companies tied to the Prescott family, long enough to witness every dirty stream of money flowing through layers of shell companies and meticulous enough to write it all down. But what few people knew was that Walter had once known Theodore Hartwell. Della's father, many years before, had respected that honest inspector and had watched in pain as he was crushed by the very machine he had dared to challenge. That was why, when Della came to him months earlier as Theodore's daughter, carrying the fragments of documents she had quietly gathered, Walter recognized in her the familiar eyes of the father he had once admired, and something inside him, a debt of conscience that had never been paid, awakened. All this time, he and Della had exchanged information in secret. He was the one who held the real ledgers, the evidence heavy enough to bring down an entire empire, while she was the one he trusted to safeguard them and piece them together, an intermediary with a more rightful motive than anyone else. Today, for the first time, Walter agreed to sit at the same table with the man Della had brought, and when he saw Rocco Abernathy walk into the cafe, a trace of caution flickered through his aging eyes, because Rocco's reputation was enough to make anyone think carefully. But Della had told him that this man was also a victim of the Prescott family's tightening grip, that their interests overlapped, and Walter, who had grown too exhausted from carrying secrets alone in constant fear, decided to place his trust in the judgment of the girl he saw as the daughter of an old friend. The conversation was tense at first, with each word weighed carefully. Rocco asked questions with the sharpness of a man used to controlling any situation, while Walter answered with the caution of someone who had learned that a misplaced word could cost a life. But gradually, when Rocco showed that he did not want to exploit those documents for his own purposes, and truly wanted to drag the Prescott family into the light, and when he spoke of Della's father with a respect that surprised both her and Walter, the guarded tension in the air began to dissolve. Della watched the man sitting across from her and realized that her suspicion of him, though not gone completely, was slowly giving way to something almost like respect, because he did not behave the way she had imagined an underworld boss would. He listened more than he spoke, and each time his eyes met hers, they held none of the cold calculation she had feared, only something steady and quiet, something almost like companionship. When Walter finally agreed that he would hand over the real ledgers at the proper time, Rocco nodded and said that this evidence, no matter how powerful, would mean nothing if it did not reach someone with both authority and integrity enough to use it. He said he knew someone, a federal prosecutor named Frances Delacroix, a woman who had spent her entire career pursuing powerful people whom local law never dared touch, someone who could not be bought and was not afraid of great names. He could not approach her directly because of his own position, but he could create a bridge, a trustworthy intermediary, to deliver the files into her hands, and that was when Della understood that her role in this fight was larger than she had ever believed. When the three of them left the cafe beneath the late afternoon light, each carrying one part of a plan that was slowly taking shape, Della felt for the first time in many years that she was no longer walking alone, and that feeling was both unfamiliar and warmed her chest in a way she could not quite describe. It took Walter nearly a week to prepare everything, and when he finally handed the real ledgers to Della, in his small apartment on a rainy evening, his hands trembled as though he were setting down a burden he had carried for so long that he had forgotten what lightness felt like. Della brought them home, spread them across the floor of her apartment beneath the murky yellow light, and together with the fragments of files she had quietly collected over the years, the full picture finally appeared, a picture darker than anything she had ever imagined. The story began with a federal worker safety fund, a massive budget allocated to ensure that factories in the region met the most basic leaf standards meant to protect workers' lives. And that money should have been used to upgrade ventilation systems, replace old and dangerous equipment, and conduct regular inspections of working conditions. But through the figures Walter had meticulously recorded, Della saw the naked truth that most of that fund had never reached the places it was meant to reach, through a tangled network of shell companies, false consulting contracts, and agreements signed in rooms where the minutes were always kept deliberately vague. The money had been drained away and funneled back into pockets that ultimately led to one place, the Prescott family, Augustus Prescott. Through many layers of carefully constructed intermediaries designed so no one could trace him directly, had turned a welfare fund into a machine for enriching himself and those loyal to him. The price of that greed was not measured in money. Della turned through the pages of files recording accidents that had happened at factories that should have been shut down long ago, places where safety systems existed only on paper, and she read the names of the workers who had suffered, ordinary laboring people who only wanted to earn a living and feed their families, people who had paid with their health and their lives for the greed of a man living in a mansion on a hill. The reports on those incidents had all been distorted, the true causes hidden behind bureaucratic explanations, honest inspectors transferred or silenced, and every name she read made her chest tighten because she understood that her father had once stood among these people, had once tried to speak the truth, and had paid the price for it. When Della closed the final ledger, she sat motionless in the darkness for a long time, not because of fear, but because of the weight of responsibility pressing down on her shoulders, and she understood that these pages were not only evidence. They were the voices of everyone who had been forced into silence, and she was the only person left to speak for them. The meeting with Francis Delacroix was arranged with extreme caution through the bridge Rocco had built, taking place at a discreet location beyond the reach of the Prescott family's watching eyes. Frances was a woman in her 50s, with silver-threaded hair pinned neatly back, and the sharp gaze of someone who had spent her entire career facing powerful people without flinching. And when Della placed the documents on the table before her, she said nothing for a long while, only quietly turning each page with the absolute focus of someone who fully understood the value of what she was holding. When she finally lifted her head to look at Della, there was a light in her eyes that was both stern and deeply admiring, and she said that what Della had brought her was not a vague accusation, but a meticulously recorded, systematic chain of evidence powerful enough to open a federal investigation that even the Prescott family could not extinguish. She asked whether Della truly understood the danger of the road she was about to step onto, and Della, with gray eyes so calm because they had grown too accustomed to fear to be ruled by it anymore, only nodded faintly and said she had been waiting for this moment almost her entire life. Della sensed something wrong the moment she stepped onto the creaking stairs leading up to her apartment that evening, a vague but persistent feeling sliding along her spine, the kind of instinct that years of living on guard had sharpened into a sixth sense. The apartment door was still locked, just as she had left it, but something was not right. A subtle shift in the air that only someone familiar with every inch of her own living space could recognize. She pushed the door open, switched on the light, and her heart sank. Everything in her small room had been disturbed in the manner of professionals trying to hide their tracks, but unable to erase their presence completely. The books on the shelf shifted out of place, drawers pushed closed but not fitted as tightly as she always left them. The chair moved a few inches from where she always kept it. Della stood frozen in the middle of the room, her breath caught in her chest, and then a cold but purposeful fear pulled her quickly toward the corner, where the loose wooden floorboard concealed the metal box. She knelt down, her trembling fingers slipping into the gap to lift the board, and only when she saw the box still lying untouched in the dark hollow beneath did she dare breathe out. But she knew, with all the cold clarity she still had left, that this was not luck but a mistaken calculation by the people who had broken in. They had searched, but they had not thought of the most hidden place, and next time, if there was a next time, she might not be so fortunate. More important than anything, this break-in was a message, a wordless warning that she was being watched, that the Prescotts had caught the scent of something and were probing, that the invisible life she had once considered her shield had now been torn open. She sank down onto the floor, clutching the metal box to her chest, and for the first time in many years, she felt that her solitude was no longer safety but exposure, because a person who lived alone had no one to call when the darkness closed in around her. It was at that very moment that her phone vibrated, and when she looked at the screen, it was a message from Rocco's number, brief and calm, asking whether she was all right. Della stared at the words for a while, wavering between the deeply rooted instinct to hide every weakness and a need to speak that she had almost forgotten how to feel, and in the end she pressed the button to call him back. When his voice came through the other end, steady and low, she told him about the ransacked apartment, in a voice she struggled to keep from shaking. Rocco listened in silence, and when she finished, his voice held no panic, only a cold certainty that somehow steadied her. He said he had feared this might happen the moment she began getting too close, that the Prescotts never moved halfway, and that from tonight on, she would no longer face them alone. He told her he had already arranged for his people to stay near the boarding house, men she would never see, but who would always be there, watching from a distance, making sure that if anyone dared come near her with ill intent, they would know. Della wanted to object, because one part of her still resisted the idea of depending on anyone's protection, but another part, the part exhausted from carrying everything alone for so many years, felt so quietly grateful that she could not find the words. That night, she moved the metal box to a safer place on Rocco's advice, and when she finally lay down in the darkness, she realized that the game had changed forever, that she had crossed a line from which there was no turning back, and that from now on, every step she took would be a step along the edge between danger and truth. But this time, strangely, she no longer felt as though she were walking alone. The Prescott family's next strike was not aimed at Della, but at the link they believed to be the weakest, and the next morning Della received a call from Walter, in a voice so trembling she almost did not recognize it. He asked to see her immediately, and when she reached his small apartment, she found a completely different man from the one who had handed her the ledgers, with trembling yet determined hands, only a few days before. Walter sat hunched in his old chair, his face pale, and on the table before him lay a piece of paper. Someone had slipped under his door in the night, without a signature, without any direct threat, only a few cold lines mentioning the name of his grown daughter who lived in another city, mentioning where she worked, mentioning her daily routine, a message written with the refined cruelty of people who knew that a father's greatest fear was never for himself. Walter lifted his head to look at Della, and in his tired eyes was the torment of a man trapped between conscience and love. He said he could not go on, that he was old now and had lived long enough not to fear for himself anymore, but he could not put his daughter in danger, could not trade his child's life for a battle he was not certain they could win. He apologized to her, his voice breaking, and said perhaps it would be best for them to stop before it was too late, before the Prescott family turned that warning into something worse. Della sat down across from him, and for a long while she said nothing, because she understood his fear more deeply than he knew. She had lived with that fear for almost her entire life. Then she began to speak, her voice quiet but steady, and she told Walter about her father, not the whole story, only the most essential parts, enough to touch the deepest place inside the old man sitting before her. She said her father, Theodore Hartwell, had once stood at this very crossroads too, had once received warnings, had once had to choose between safety and truth, and he had chosen to speak. She said he had paid dearly for that choice, more dearly than anyone should ever have to pay. But what hurt her most was not the price he paid, but the fact that he had paid it alone, with no one standing beside him, no one at his back, abandoned by the very systems he had trusted. She told Walter that her father had died believing the truth was worth more than safety. But he had died too soon, too alone, and the truth he had sacrificed everything to protect had been buried for years. Then her voice caught, and she said that was why she could not stop, that if they gave up now, then her father's death and the deaths of all those innocent workers would become meaningless, would become nothing more than names erased inside distorted files. But she also told Walter that this time was different, that he was not alone the way her father had once been alone, that they had one another, they had Rocco, they had Francis Delacroix and the weight of federal law behind them, and that his fear was justified, but it did not have to win. She promised him his daughter would be protected, that she would tell Rocco to have his people watch over the girl, and that she would never let Walter suffer the fate her father had suffered. Walter listened to her, and when she finished, tears rolled down his wrinkled face, not the tears of weakness, but of something being mended inside his soul, an old debt to a dead friend finally finding a way to be repaid. He reached out with a trembling hand and took Della's, and in a hoarse voice that had regained its resolve, he said he would stand firm, that for Theodore, for his daughter, and for all those who no longer had a voice, he would follow this road to the end. That night, after leaving Walter's apartment, Della returned to her room and sat down by the window, looking out at the city of Holloway glittering in the darkness, and for the first time in a very long while, she allowed the memory of her father to come flooding back in full, instead of locking it away. As she always did so, she could keep moving forward. She remembered Theodore Hartwell not through the last image she had of him, but through the warm evenings when she was still a young woman, when their small kitchen in Mercer Falls was filled with the smell of her mother's cooking and the sound of her father turning through thick stacks of files beneath the yellow lamp, a man who believed his work mattered, who believed that protecting ordinary workers from dangerous working conditions was a mission worthy of a lifetime. He had been a labor safety inspector devoted almost to the point of stubbornness, a man who trusted the system with an innocence Della would later understand was both his strength and his fatal weakness. She had been 22, studying her final years of law with the dream of carrying on her father's ideals, when everything began to collapse. During an inspection, Theodore discovered serious violations at a series of factories, dangerous working conditions that had been hidden, safety funds that had been drained away, and when he followed those traces, they led him to powerful names he should never have touched. He did what his conscience told him to do. He reported his findings through the official channels he trusted, but those channels did not respond the way he had hoped. His reports were ignored, delayed, then buried. When he stubbornly tried to push the matter further, pressure began to fall on him, first in the form of vague warnings, then in his transfer to a meaningless position, and finally, when he still refused to stay silent, he lost his job completely under an excuse that had been carefully arranged. Della remembered the time that followed as one long nightmare, as her father, the man who had once been so full of faith and life, slowly withered beneath the weight of isolation and legal battles he did not have the resources to fight. People who had once been his colleagues turned away out of fear, doors slammed shut in front of him, and with each passing month he grew quieter, thinner, the invisible burden on his shoulders heavier and heavier. His health collapsed quickly under relentless stress, and one morning, while Della was away for school, he died of a heart attack, quietly and alone, in the house that had once been filled with laughter and now held only emptiness. He died branded as a failure, a man rumored to have lost his mind over absurd accusations, and the truth he had sacrificed everything to protect was buried with him. It took many years before a late investigation revealed a portion of what he had been right about, but by then it was already too late. No one remembered his name. No apology was ever given. No clearing of his name was enough to return what had been taken from him. Della had read that report alone, and she had not cried, because her tears had run dry long before, but in that moment something inside her hardened into iron resolve. She abandoned her dream of becoming a lawyer, not because she had given up her ideals, but because she chose another path, quieter and more dangerous, the path of tracing the very people who had destroyed her father, so that one day she could drag them into the light. The pain of losing her father was no longer merely a wound she carried. It had become the foundation of who she was, the load-bearing structure beneath every decision she made, present in every silent step she had taken for years. And now, sitting by the window and looking out at the city, Della whispered to her dead father that this time would be different, that this time the truth would not be buried, and that she would not let him wait in vain ever again. That same night, not far away, Rocco Abernathy was also sitting alone in his office on the upper floor, and what he had learned about Della's father had awakened memories in him that he rarely allowed himself to touch. Because although his life and the life of that girl had begun in two worlds that seemed completely opposed, one rising to the height of underground power, while the other sank into the depths of invisibility, deep down, both of them had been shaped from the same raw material: deprivation and loneliness. Rocco had grown up in the poorest neighborhoods of Holloway, where survival was the first lesson, and also the only lesson no one needed to teach. He had never known the warmth of a whole home. His parents had left this world when he was too young to keep any real memory of them, and he was passed from one temporary shelter to another, growing up among people too busy struggling with their own poverty to give him anything more than a place to sleep. He remembered his childhood not through specific images, but through a long, hollow feeling, the cold of winter nights without enough blankets, the dull hunger that became a familiar companion, and above all, the loneliness of a child who understood very early that in this world, no one was coming to save him. It was from that barren ground that Rocco grew, and when he stepped into adulthood, he carried with him a hardness forged by deprivation, and a sharp intelligence honed by cruel circumstances. In his younger years, he had seen how the world worked for people who had nothing in their hands, how those with power trampled the vulnerable without punishment, how honest laborers in the neighborhoods where he lived were exploited, cheated, and driven to the edge by people sitting in elegant offices who never once had to look into the faces of their victims. He had seen neighbors lose their homes because of trap-laden contracts, workers denied wages with no way to demand justice, families breaking apart beneath the weight of a system designed to protect the strong and crush the weak. And something inside Rocco, a slow, burning flame of righteous anger, swore that he would never allow himself to become one of the crushed. He rose, step by step, through intelligence and iron will, building himself a place in the city's underground world, a world whose true nature he did not romanticize. He knew very well that the road he had taken had not always been clean, knew that his hands were not entirely unstained, but among all the gray places he had been forced to walk through in order to survive and rise, he had still kept one line he had never crossed, one unchanging rule. He never used his power to trample those weaker than himself, never became the thing he had hated throughout his youth. And he held deep contempt for those born into silk and luxury, who used their privilege to torment people who had no way to strike back. That was why, on that night at Cinder and Sage, when he saw the Prescott daughter pour meaningless cruelty onto a waitress simply because she could, something inside him had been unable to remain seated. And now, after understanding Della's story, after understanding that she too was a person shaped by loss who had chosen to stand rather than collapse, Rocco felt a resonance he had never felt with anyone before. Two people, two fates that seemed worlds apart, reflected each other like two sides of the same mirror. Both carried scars that could not be seen. Both refused to let the world turn them cruel. And in that reflection, Rocco realized that this fight, for him, was no longer only about business or revenge, but had become something far more personal and far deeper. The public hearing was convened on an October morning in the Great Hall of the Federal Building in downtown Holloway, a room large enough to hold hundreds of people, and that morning there was not a single empty seat left. The investigation Francis Delacroix had launched from the documents Della provided had moved forward quietly for many weeks, gathering more testimony, comparing more evidence, until it carried enough weight to force an official hearing, and now the whole city was watching. Augustus Prescott entered the hall with the bearing of a man who had decided that the only acceptable posture was absolute confidence, and he committed himself to it completely. He wore a dark suit and a tie in the exact color scheme of his campaign, surrounded by a team of expensive lawyers and a group of supporters, holding signs calling on people to stand with him, and he shook hands, smiled for the cameras, as though this were a campaign event and not a hearing that could bury his career. When he was invited to speak, Augustus rose and began, and it had to be admitted that purely as a matter of oratory, he was truly impressive. His voice was deep, steady, and persuasive. His pauses were perfectly calculated, and he looked directly at the members of the panel, as well as the cameras at the far end of the room, with the righteous indignation of a man who believed he was being wronged. He called the investigation a product of political hatred, a coordinated attack by forces threatened by his reform program, a desperate attempt to silence a servant of the people who had dared to stand up against the powerful. He spoke of his years of service to the city, of the projects that bore his mark, of the love he had for working people, and those words were delivered with the practiced skill of a politician who had spent his life making hollow things sound sacred. In the section reserved for the audience, his supporters nodded along, and for one moment it seemed as though the power of eloquence might be enough to shake even the truth. Then Augustus Prescott sat down, and Della Hartwell stood. She wore nothing splendid, only simple, clean clothes. Her dark brown hair parted elegantly and pinned back with absolute poise, and when she walked to the presentation stand, the entire hall seemed to pause before the contrast between this calm, small woman and the powerful man who had just left the stage. She had no team of lawyers surrounding her, no signs of support, no staged outrage. She had only a folder in her hands and a cold composure that made people pay attention. She began to speak, and her voice did not tremble, did not rise, carried no unnecessary drama, only an even, clear precision down to every detail. She did not appeal to emotion, did not accuse with ornate language. She simply presented the truth the way truth was meant to be presented, through numbers, dates, names, arranged in a sequence that could not be refuted. She began with the Federal Worker Safety Fund, traced the money through each layer of shell companies, and pointed out each place where funds meant to protect human lives had been diverted into private pockets. Each sentence she spoke was a link in a tight chain of logic, and the more she spoke, the more the contrast between her and Augustus Prescott became so clear that no one could fail to see it. Where he used emotion, she used evidence. Where he called for pity, she offered truth. Where he spoke loudly of his own purity, she quietly placed on the table the documents proving the opposite. Several members of the panel, those who had entered the hearing with the skepticism of people who thought this was only a political attack, slowly lost that skepticism, and at some point during her presentation, the vast hall sank into a silence so tense that one could hear paper turning. Augustus Prescott sat at his table, his face still holding the composure he had practiced. But in his eyes, for the first time, a trace of unease began to creep in, because he realized that the small woman standing there could not be defeated with the weapons he was accustomed to using. When Della finished presenting her documents, Augustus Prescott's legal team immediately struck back, arguing that everything just presented was merely a set of numbers that could be interpreted in many ways, that there was no evidence directly linking their client to those decisions, that a complex network of shell companies did not equal the guilt of one specific individual. For a moment, it seemed as though the familiar skepticism began to creep back into the hall, because those legal arguments, empty as they were in a moral sense, still carried technical weight, and Augustus Prescott, sensing that opening, allowed a trace of confidence to return to his face. But then Frances Delacroix stood, and in the calm voice of someone who had saved the strongest card for the precise moment it was needed, she informed the panel that the investigation still had one final piece of evidence to present. Walter Penhaligon was called forward, and the old man who had once trembled with fear now walked to the stand with a steadiness even he had not known he still possessed, carrying the notebook in which he had recorded everything so meticulously through all those years working inside the Prescott machine. He confirmed his identity, confirmed his role, and then he read aloud the detailed notes about meetings he had personally attended, meetings where decisions to conceal violations had been made, with specific dates, the people present, and the instructions handed down. But the climax came when Frances Delacroix had a video played from the security camera system of one of the factories, a recording Walter had secretly kept as insurance for his own life. The footage did not show any accident, contained no heartbreaking images, only the scene of a meeting room with clear audio, and in it rang out a voice the entire hall had been hearing all morning, the voice of Augustus Prescott himself. In the recording, he did not sound like a devoted servant of the people. His voice was cold and calculating as he gave orders, in words that could not be misunderstood, that the reports about safety problems at the factory had to be handled quietly, that the numbers had to be adjusted, that any inspector who caused difficulty had to be transferred before they could create trouble. He mentioned keeping everything out of the official record, mentioned payments meant to guarantee silence, and in one sentence that made Della's chest tighten, he spoke of handling the problem the same way they had done before, a sentence that directly referred to the very events that had destroyed her father's life. When the footage ended, the entire vast hall sank into absolute silence, the kind of silence so heavy it seemed even the air had frozen. Hundreds of people who had just witnessed an undeniable truth exposed before their eyes. The supporters who had nodded along to Augustus's speech now sat motionless, the signs in their hands drooping low. Augustus Prescott sat at his table, and for the first time that morning, the carefully practiced mask of composure on his face cracked. His face went pale, his hands tightened around the edge of the table, and he could not say a word. His legal team lowered their heads and whispered among themselves with barely controlled panic. Then one of them stood and requested an emergency recess. Augustus rose, and when he walked out of the hall surrounded by his lawyers, he did not look toward the panel, did not look toward the cameras, and did not look toward the small woman who had done what an entire system of power had believed could not be done. His walk was no longer the walk of a powerful man, but that of a man who had just realized the ground beneath his feet had collapsed. Della stood silently watching him leave, and in that moment she did not feel the triumph she had once imagined, only a deep and quiet peace, because the scales of justice, after so many years tilted out of place, had finally begun to return to where they belonged. The collapse of Augustus Prescott unfolded, with the irreversible logic of a structure whose foundation had been pulled away, each level falling after the next in an order no force could still prevent. That very afternoon, before the hearing had even ended, the recording had already escaped the four walls of the hall and begun its uncontrollable journey through news channels and social media, and by nightfall, the Prescott name no longer meant what it had meant that morning. The two largest donors to his campaign announced their withdrawal that very night, their statements written in the careful language of people eager to separate themselves from a sinking ship as quickly as possible. By the next morning, the state party chair issued a statement expressing deep concern and calling for full cooperation with the federal investigation, a polished way of saying that all ties had been cut. The political allies who had once surrounded Augustus, the people who had once competed for photographs beside him, turned away one by one, each issuing a statement of distance in their own words, and within only a few days, the man who had stood only a short distance from the most powerful office in the state found himself completely alone. He announced his withdrawal from the race, through a brief statement read by a spokesperson instead of appearing himself, and that statement spoke of a desire to spend time with family, of allowing the city to move forward without distraction, but it did not contain a single admission, a single apology, or anything that might have meant something to the people who had been harmed. Not long after, Francis Delacroix formally announced the charges, and Augustus Prescott was indicted on a series of counts involving fraud, embezzlement of public funds, and obstruction of justice, a complete collapse of everything he had spent more than 2 decades building. But amid all that wreckage, there was one person who suffered another kind of loss, quieter but no less profound, and that was Cordelia. The girl who had once believed the world had been designed to revolve around her, now watched that world withdraw from her little by little. The video from that night at Cinder and Sage, recorded by her own friends, eventually surfaced amid the storm of information, and it attached itself to her name in a way no explanation could remove. The image of her standing there with the bowl tilted in her hand and a satisfied smile on her lips became a symbol of everything people despised about privilege, and it followed her everywhere. The friends who had once surrounded her, the ones who had laughed at every joke she made and competed to be seen beside her, vanished with the efficiency of people who always knew how to calculate and had simply adjusted their calculations. Invitations stopped coming. Events where her presence had once been assumed now went on without her, and for the first time in her life, Cordelia faced silence. She did not experience it as mistreatment, which surprised even her, but as an enormous emptiness she did not know how to fill, a sudden stillness in a life that had never had to face the consequence of anything. She sat alone in her large, expensive apartment, now strangely quiet, and slowly, painfully, she began to do something she had never done in all 25 years of her life. She began to look back at herself, She thought about the face of the waitress she had burned, about the calm in those gray eyes, about the way that woman had remained standing while she herself had been the one to finally fall, and a strange, heavy feeling began forming in her chest, something it took her some time to recognize as shame. It was not a complete awakening, not yet, but it was the beginning of something, the first seed of a different person, who might one day grow from the wreckage she was sitting in. Winter came to Holloway with the first cold winds of the season, and at a rehabilitation center on the south side of the city, where workers injured in the factories came to heal both body and spirit, a new face appeared among the volunteers. Though no one knew who she was, Cordelia Prescott had chosen this place not by accident, because during the long weeks she had spent sitting alone amid the wreckage of her old life, she had read carefully about what her family had done, had seen the names of the people who had paid with their health for that greed, and an urge she could not name had led her to the very place where the victims of the Prescott factories came to rise again. She came quietly, telling no one her real name, doing the smallest tasks no one else wanted to do, pushing wheelchairs, cleaning up, listening to stories she once would never have bothered to hear, and slowly, day by day, something inside her began to change from the root. It was there, one afternoon, that she came face to face with Della. As it turned out, the woman with the calm gray eyes also came there as a volunteer, and in the moment their eyes met, the whole room seemed to fall silent around them both. Cordelia froze, every word she had ever rehearsed in her mind suddenly dissolving. But Della did not turn away, nor did she show anger. She only looked at Cordelia with the gaze of someone who had passed through too much pain to keep feeding hatred. Just then, an elderly worker sitting in a wheelchair in the corner needed help. A man Della knew had once worked at the very factory where her father had gone to inspect so many years before, and without either woman saying a word, they both stepped toward him. Together they helped the old man. Together they adjusted the chair. Together they listened as he spoke of the old days. And in that quiet shared action, without any grand words, Cordelia softly told Della that she was sorry, that she knew an apology could not erase what she had done, but she needed to say it, and that she was trying to become a different person. Della looked at her for a long while, then answered gently that a person's dignity should never be measured by status or by the uniform they wore, that what gave a person worth was the way they treated those from whom they had nothing to gain, and that Cordelia's presence here, doing these things, was already a beginning. It was not complete forgiveness, and they both understood that, but it was a fragile bridge across a distance that had once seemed impossible to cross. In the months that followed, Della's life began to open in directions she had not dared dream of for many years. She enrolled again in law classes at night, taking up the dream she had once laid down beside her father's grave, this time not to escape her pain, but to turn it into something useful for those who still needed a voice. At the ceremony marking her official return to school, among the crowd of unfamiliar faces, she saw Rocco Abernathy standing quietly at the back of the room, still with that same calm bearing, and when their eyes met, he gave her a slight nod, a simple gesture that contained all the respect one human being could offer another. Between them there were no hurried promises, nothing spoken aloud, only a quiet understanding between two people shaped by loss who had chosen to stand instead of fall, a bond left open to the future, built on the strongest foundation of all, their respect for each other. That night, when Della returned to her small apartment, she did something she had postponed for many years. She took out the old photograph of her father, the photograph she had once never dared look at for too long, and this time she placed it with honor on the bookshelf, right where the morning light could touch it every day. She stood silently looking at the face of the father she had lost for a long while, then whispered simply that this time, "Papa, my 5 years of waiting were not in vain, that the truth had been spoken while it still had time to matter, and that he could rest now because the road he had once walked alone had someone to carry it forward." And that is the story of Della Hartwell, the woman the whole world once treated as invisible, yet who became the one holding the key that opened every locked door, a story that reminds us that human dignity must never be measured by wealth or status, that quiet kindness has a power greater than any show of authority, and that the truth, no matter how long it has been buried, will always find its way back into the light. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so we can listen together to many meaningful and captivating stories every day. We would love to know how you feel about Della's story. What part of her journey moved you the most? So please leave a comment below and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because every word you write is a precious encouragement to us. May everyone listening to this story always have abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and calm in every passing day. Thank you sincerely for staying with us all the way to the final lines. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.